How can an attacker convince people to do something that they would not otherwise do? One of the most commonly exploited human weaknesses in social engineering is greed. Offer people something that they want. Let me give you a perfect example. You have almost certainly received emails like this, and certainly one of the most common exposures that you have to social engineering is via phishing emails. In this case, the attacker is preying on the greed of the victim, and this is why we see an offer of $4.5 million. There are tens of thousands of variations of this very same email. Hey, I've got a heap of money. I'd like to try and give you some. I just need a little bit of information from you. And of course, the information being requested down here will then lead into further questions and ultimately the attacker socially engineering personally identifiable data out of the victim. Many times these emails also lead to the attacker socially engineering money directly out of the victim, both of which are obviously quite attractive to the social engineer. So greed is a human weakness that makes us all vulnerable. Another weakness is fear. If we can frighten the victim into acting in a way that they wouldn't normally do, that can give the social engineer an upside. Here's a good example of that. This is an extortion email that followed after the Patreon data breach in 2015. Here the attacker is relying entirely on the fear of the victim. And they're doing that by saying that they have sensitive personal information about the victim. And if money is not paid, they're going to leak that information online, which would damage their credit score. If a victim is fearful enough about that happening, they may act irrationally and actually pay the ransom. Now, in this case, the data leaked out of the Patreon system was actually very well encrypted. It's highly unlikely that the attacker could actually do anything with it, but that doesn't matter. All that matters is that the attacker can scare the victim enough that they're convinced they need to pay the ransom. There's also another weakness being preyed on down towards the bottom, and it's this one here about the time limit. There is urgency implied in this email. Act within 48 hours or your data is going to be leaked. Which brings me to the next human weakness. Urgency. When people feel that they're under pressure to perform an action within a given period of time, they'll act irrationally. This is how many of the infomercials that you see on TV work. Act now in order to get your discount. Offer valid only for the next 20 callers or the next 2 hours or whatever the social engineer can use to convince the target that there's urgency. And make no mistake, a lot of marketing is social engineering as well. But let me give you an example within information security of urgency as a weapon of the social engineer. Also in 2015, we saw this story about how John Brennan, the director of the CIA, had his personal email hacked. Now in this case, the attacker was socially engineering Verizon, his telecoms provider. And the social engineer pretended to be an employee of Verizon. And he called up the company and said, hey, my tools are down. I'm trying to fix something urgently, but I can't get access. Can you just give me a little bit of information about the director of the CIA, and then I'll be able to fix the problem. So the attacker implied urgency in order to get the Verizon worker to behave in a way that was almost certainly against their better judgment. Another human weakness we often see exploited in social engineering attacks is curiosity. The saying goes that curiosity killed the cat, and it's that same behavior that gets humans into trouble when they're being socially engineered. For example, this Facebook post. I wrote about this back in 2012, and it's a classic clickjacking scam. I saw this appear on my timeline because a friend of mine had liked the link. It was out of character for them, so I did some further investigation. And what's happening here is we've got a story that makes people curious. We often see this style of bait headlines or bait advertising. And you'll see things like, you wouldn't believe what happened next, or try this one unique trick, something that makes people curious enough to click through. In this particular case, once you clicked through and tried to play the video to see what the girl was actually doing, it used a clickjacking vulnerability within Facebook to cause you to like the post. And of course, once you like a post on Facebook, your friends see that you like the post. And then they take a look at it, and then their friends see that they liked the post. And the whole thing propagates. Even my mother-in-law fell for this one. And I don't think it's that she was genuinely interested in the content of the story, but she was curious. And curiosity will get people to do all sorts of things that they wouldn't normally do. Another human weakness is sympathy. Now, we might not often think of sympathy as being a weakness, but it is a behavior that can be exploited via a social engineer. Let me give you an example. This is one variation of a scam that's been going for a very long time now. Sometimes this is referred to as the grandma or the imposter scam, and it tells stories of misfortune in order to get the recipient of the email to feel sympathetic to the sender. We were mugged at the park of the hotel where we stayed. And then, of course, they just need a little bit of money to help them get back on their feet. And then they'll send that money back to the victim. Allegedly. Of course, that doesn't actually happen. We've seen variations of this scam either sent as random spam or sent to everyone in the address book of a compromised email account. So if you saw this coming from someone you know and you thought they were in trouble, you would feel sympathetic. Would that sympathy possibly cause you to follow the instructions precisely here and send them money? Quite possibly. Certainly this has been successful enough that it has actually continued to run for a long time. So sympathy, as much as we often think of it as a positive attribute, can be used for evil. Respect for authority is one that you're going to see a lot throughout the remainder of this course, primarily because when someone believes somebody else is in a position of authority, particularly a position that commands a degree of respect, the victim is likely to behave in ways they wouldn't normally do. For example, if the victim believes that they're talking to their boss, or even perhaps the CEO of the company, they're going to behave in a way that they wouldn't normally do with someone they didn't have the same level of respect for. Let me give you an example of respect for authority. This is a scam allegedly run by the Australian Federal Police, and it's a speeding fine scam. This is not legitimate. The AFP doesn't send traffic infringement notices via email in this fashion. And in fact, if you did click through to this, your machine may have been infected with ransomware. So definitely not the outcome that victims were expecting. An attack like this is successful because if someone can be convinced that they're talking to the police, they're going to show a level of respect that they wouldn't otherwise have shown. Now in this case, it's not only the authority figures sending the message, but they're also applying urgency, which is what we just saw before. So often these attacks will use multiple behaviors or exploit multiple weaknesses in people in order to achieve the social engineer's objective. Helpfulness is another one of these behaviors that we probably don't normally think of as a weakness. It's a positive attribute. You would like people to be helpful. But that can also be a weakness. If the social engineer can leverage the helpful nature of an individual to their advantage, they can often obtain information that they never would have otherwise been able to get their hands on. Let me give you a perfect example of this. In 2013, the whistleblower Edward Snowden exfiltrated a huge number of confidential documents from the NSA. Part of what made this attack successful was that he was able to socially engineer his co-workers into providing their credentials. Allegedly, he persuaded between 20 and 25 co-workers to give him their usernames and passwords by convincing them he needed them to do his job as a computer systems administrator. This is simply preying on the helpful nature of his colleagues. Their intentions were no doubt good. They wanted to help their fellow worker achieve his job. But of course, as we now know, Snowden used that information to access a huge amount of data that he should never have had access to. He successfully socially engineered those colleagues by exploiting their human weakness, which was helpfulness. So that's a bunch of weaknesses that we all have that have been used in various ways to mount social engineering attacks. As we progress through the remainder of this course, I'm going to often refer back to these weaknesses, and we'll look at precisely what it was about the victim that the attacker exploited in order to make their social engineering attack successful. Let's now move on and have a look at a couple of different types of social engineering attack.